Brendan O'Connor, welcome.
Morning, Barry.
So you made a big fuss about this, about Dyson Heydon. It was business as usual on Friday, so you didn't really get very far with that.
Well, I think it's clear that the Commissioner accepted an invitation to a Liberal Party fundraiser and therefore he should disqualify himself from the office of Commission, of this Royal Commission, and if he doesn't, the Prime Minister needs to act.
It was an $80 a head fundraiser, which would barely cover the meal cost, you would think. It was a law lecture. And he thought at the time that the Royal Commission would have ended its duties by then.
Well, it doesn't really matter how much money was raised by the Liberal Party. The New South Wales division of the Liberal Party presented this as a fundraiser. There was a logo of the Liberal Party. The cheques will be to be made out to the Liberal Party. And even when the Commissioner chose to withdraw from the event, in that email to Gregory Burton, in that email itself, the Commissioner says he would be willing to do it at a later event. That in itself means he has an association with a political party, namely the Liberal Party, that shows, at the very least, Barry, an appearance of a conflict of interest. And in fact, in Commissioner Heydon's own words, in a 2011 judgment when he was a High Court judge, he said, any appearance of a departure from neutrality is grounds for disqualification. Well, if his own words mean anything to him, he must resign and disqualify himself from this position.
Right, you say he must resign. He didn't even address the issue when the Royal Commission resumed on Friday. Clearly he's not going. What can you do about it?
Well, we'll continue to pursue this in Parliament. We believe that we think from the beginning, and I said this on this program in February last year, that this is a political witch hunt. $80 million of taxpayers' money spent by the government to attack its political opponents. You've seen John Howard come out and say how uneasy he felt about Tony Abbott setting up these royal commissions. We've had 3 Labor leaders call to these royal commissions. And it's therefore really at the feet of the Prime Minister. Now, of course, there might be other ways that this can be dealt with, but right now this is a mess because the Prime Minister decided to set up a witch hunt into his opponents.
The ACTU is considering legal action. Is that something that you think would be sensible on their part, and is it something the Labor Party would support?
Look, I think any affected parties before the Commission have to look at their rights here. What we've said from the beginning, that there's been evidence of bias. I mean, this is an extension of the executive, Barry. You have situations where testimony is uncontested because the Commission refuses to allow cross-examination, and that those uncontested assertions are then used as facts by Cabinet ministers in question time. I mean, can you imagine the Royal Commission that the Labor Party set up being used in this type of way? This is a politically partisan commission. It's been used in that way. There's information released to the media before affected parties have even seen that information. Of course, the parties directly affected and indeed expressly referred to in the terms of reference should be considering their legal rights, not least of all the competence of the Commissioner to continue.
But given the Labor Party's links with the union, I think people can understand why you would like to see this thing closed down, because it's looking into corruption, into the union movement.
Well, we said, and again I said this in February last year on this program, that any allegations of serious misconduct or criminal misconduct should be investigated. But there are already agencies of government. There is an Australian Crime Commission, Barry, with coercive powers that can investigate serious allegations of crime anywhere, whether it be in one sector of the economy or anywhere else. Now, I do recall when this was established that Senator Betts said this would be a sword that cuts both ways, but there's not been a bipartisan approach taken to these matters. There is clearly a focus entirely upon the union movement and trying to draw associations with the union movement to the political opponents of the government, and indeed, as I said at the time, the intervention by the Commissioner during the testimony of Bill Shorten was quite highly unusual.
In what way?
Well, in the manner in which he chose to prejudice, I believe, the efforts by Bill Shorten to answer hundreds upon hundreds of questions. Now, it reveals, as a result...
But it's not clear. What did he do that offended you?
Well, to suggest, to infer that that Mr Shorten was... there was issues around his credibility. Now, the real question here is the credibility of the Commissioner presiding over matter that was set up for political purposes, and now we find that he has a direct association with the Liberal Party, accepting an invitation, and even on his withdrawal from that event, he says in an email he'd be willing to attend similar events. Now, there is no capacity... I mean, Commissioner Heydon, as a judge, has said that any appearance of a conflict of interest would disqualify one from office. He should know exactly what he has to do.
But if he did step aside, the Royal Commission would collapse, wouldn't it? You couldn't then restart it under another commissioner. It would be just too expensive for a start.
Well, I think, as I say, I've followed this quite closely. I do think there's improper behaviour of the Commission, as I've said before. And yes, the proceedings to date are tainted entirely from beginning to end because of this conflict. But irrespective of that, the Commissioner must disqualify himself from office.
Whatever happens, though, the Royal Commission has already recommended charges be considered, criminal charges of fraud against CFMEU officials. Should at least those charges or those allegations be tested in a court?
Well, that's entirely up to, of course, the Director of Public Prosecutions and others to deal with any allegations of misconduct, whether it be by an employer or a union official or an employer body or a representative of a company. Those matters should be dealt with in courts of law. This is not a court of law. It's an extension of executive government, the terms of reference of which have been written by the Prime Minister, the Attorney-General and the Minister for Employment. I mean, the Attorney-General, who of course was the first guest speaker to this event, and Commissioner Heydon was going to be the sixth speaker to this event. I think the Australian public would be very concerned about this association. There is, at the very least, Barrie, an appearance of a conflict of interest, and that is enough for him to have to
and apparently, according to Mark Dreyfus, only the appearance of bias, whereas you and Tony Burke seem to be saying that it's bias, no question.
Well, I do believe, having watched the conduct of the Commission, the way it coordinates with the media, the way it discloses unsubstantiated facts, the way its inconsistent application of using, for example, cross-examination, allowing very damning testimony that's not even contested to sit in the public domain, and on other occasions allow for cross-examination. I think there is a conflict, but I think that Mark Dreyfus also makes the point that even if there's just an appearance, that's sufficient for the Commissioner to have to disqualify himself from this position.
Now, Parliament House cleaners are taking industrial action this week. They won't be cleaning the bathrooms and the toilets of MPs for a whole week. How are you going to cope with that?
Well, I'll survive, and I don't blame them, quite frankly. They're losing their employment conditions. We've opposed the government's decision to cut their rates of pay. It doesn't matter where you look with respect to this government, whether it's being an apologist for companies sacking workers by text, whether it's cutting cleaners' wages that clean the offices of the Prime Minister and others. This government has no regard, and has a callous disregard for working people in this nation. And I can't blame those cleaners wanting to take that action.
According to the unions, they're on $21.17 an hour, and they haven't had a pay rise in 3 years. It doesn't sit very well with the entitlements that MPs have.
Well, I think just insofar as those cleaners themselves, these are hard-working people who sometimes have 3 jobs, and they shouldn't be treated in that manner. I can completely understand how they feel. They believe they had an undertaking. The Abbott government was elected and they've abolished their Clean Start guidelines. I addressed a rally of those cleaners because I thought it was unfair. Yes, it seems very unfair that Cabinet Ministers' offices may not have cleaners in them, but the unfairness is indeed what's happening to those cleaners. And I think the government should rethink its position, just like I think they should have rethought their position about excusing a company for sacking workers by text.
Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks, Barrie.